Think about your garden right now. How many hours did you spend last month just keeping it alive? Watering, weeding, fighting pests, replacing dead plants, hauling amendments. Now think about this. Indigenous growers built food systems that sustained communities for centuries, and they didn't spend their lives intervening. They spent their time observing. They designed gardens where plants worked as teams, where soil built itself, where water stayed put, where pests got confused instead of controlled. I'm going to show you 12 principles self-sufficient gardeners use to escape the maintenance trap. These aren't trendy hacks. They're systems that worked for generations because they're built on relationships, not products. Stop fighting your garden. Start designing it. Let me tell you what's actually happening in your garden right now. Every weekend, you're out there pulling weeds that somehow multiply faster than you can remove them. You're watering every single day because everything wilts by afternoon. You're dumping fertilizer into soil that seems to eat money without growing healthier plants. You're spraying pests that come back within days. You're replacing dead plants with new ones that die just as fast. Your garden has become an expensive treadmill, and you're exhausted. But here's the reality most people miss. You're not failing at gardening. You're gardening backwards. Think about it. Indigenous growers fed entire communities for centuries without pesticides, without fertilizer trucks, without garden center credit cards, without turning every weekend into a maintenance emergency. How? They weren't intervening constantly. They were observing relationships between plants, between soil organisms, between water patterns and root structures, between insects that compete and insects that cooperate. They designed systems where plants worked as teams, where soil built itself, where water stayed put, where problems prevented themselves before they appeared. You're fighting a war. They built an ecosystem. That's the difference between modern gardening and self-sufficient gardening. Modern gardening sold you a battlefield, rows of identical plants standing alone, vulnerable, dependent on your constant intervention. Monocultures that scream, "Eat me," to every pest in the neighborhood. Bare soil that bakes in the sun and bleeds nutrients with every rain. A design that creates the problems you're paying to solve. Meanwhile, self-sufficient gardeners are using principles that worked for generations because they're built on observation, not products. They're not spending their weekends intervening. They're spending their time enjoying gardens that regulate themselves. Now let's talk about what self-sufficient gardeners actually do differently. Principle 1 is polycultures, not monocultures. Nature doesn't do rows of identical plants. Walk into any forest and you'll see diversity stacked vertically and horizontally. Trees, shrubs, ground covers, vines, all occupying different niches, all contributing something different to the system. Self-sufficient gardeners copy that. They plant teams, not solos. Here's what most people miss. Monocultures are vulnerability factories. When every plant in your garden is the same species, pests and diseases spread instantly. One problem becomes everyone's problem. But when you mix species, pests get confused. They can't carpet bomb their way through your garden because their target keeps disappearing between plants they don't recognize or don't want. Principle 2 is companion planting, but not the Pinterest version. Self-sufficient gardeners aren't pairing plants because they look pretty together. They're pairing plants based on function. Marigolds near tomatoes because marigolds emit a scent that confuses tomato hornworms. Basil near tomatoes because basil repels aphids and whiteflies. Beans near corn because beans climb the corn stalks and fix nitrogen in the soil while they grow. Carrots near onions because their scent profiles mask each other from pests that hunt by smell. Every plant is doing multiple jobs: feeding you, feeding the soil, protecting neighbors, attracting beneficial insects, suppressing weeds, retaining moisture. That's how you stop paying for solutions to problems your design created. Here's where it gets interesting. Principle 3 is nitrogen fixing plants embedded throughout the system, not as a separate project. You know those bags of fertilizer you're buying every season? That's mostly nitrogen. You're paying for what certain plants make for free. Beans, peas, clover, vetch, lupines. They have root nodules that host bacteria capable of pulling nitrogen from the air and converting it into a form plants can use. When those plants die, or when you trim them back, that nitrogen gets released into the soil. Free fertilizer, generated on site, exactly where you need it. Self-sufficient gardeners don't plant a nitrogen fixer and then harvest it all. They plant nitrogen fixers between heavy feeders like tomatoes, peppers, squash. They trim the nitrogen fixer back multiple times during the season, letting the leaves fall as mulch and the roots decompose in place. The system feeds itself. Principle 4 is living mulch. You're spending money on bagged mulch because you left your soil naked. Naked soil bakes in the sun, loses moisture to evaporation, gets compacted by rain, and invites weeds to colonize the bare real estate. Self-sufficient gardeners don't leave soil naked. They plant ground covers that hug the soil surface. Clover, thyme, strawberries, creeping oregano. These living mulches suppress weeds by occupying the space weeds want. They retain moisture by shading the soil. Many of them fix nitrogen while they work. Some of them are edible. You're getting food, weed suppression, moisture retention, and soil fertility from the same plant doing the same job. But here's the reality. The teaching system that shows how all these principles work together is the three sisters: corn, beans, squash. Indigenous growers across the Americas used this combination for centuries because each plant does a job that supports the others. Corn grows tall and provides a trellis structure. Beans climb the corn stalks instead of needing stakes you'd have to buy and install. And while they climb, their roots are fixing nitrogen that feeds the corn. Squash sprawls across the ground as a living mulch, shading the soil, retaining moisture, suppressing weeds with its massive leaves. 3 plants, 5 functions. Structure, nitrogen, food, weed suppression, moisture retention. That's systems thinking. That's what self-sufficient gardeners do. You can run this same system in a large container on a balcony. 5-gallon bucket, 1 corn plant, 2 bean plants around the base, 1 squash at the edge. Same relationships, smaller scale. But here's what most people miss. You're buying amendments every season because you removed the fertility generators from your design. Self-sufficient gardeners don't haul in compost and fertilizer. They build soil in place. That's principle 5. Chop and drop. In-place composting. Instead of pulling plants out when they're done producing and hauling them to a compost pile, self-sufficient gardeners cut them at soil level and let them fall where they grew. Leaves become mulch. Roots decompose in place, creating channels for water and air while feeding soil organisms. Nitrogen gets released exactly where the next plant will need it. The system feeds itself without you bagging, hauling, turning, or buying anything. Think about what you're doing right now. You're pulling out spent tomato plants, hauling them away, then buying compost to replace the organic matter you just removed. That's working backwards. Chop the plant at the base, let it rot where it grew. Plant the next crop right into that fertility. Now let's talk about water, because this is where most people are burning the most time. You're watering every single day because your design forces you to. Principle 6 is passive water capture and retention. Self-sufficient gardeners don't fight water. They design systems that hold it. Swales are shallow ditches on contour that catch runoff and let it soak into the soil instead of running off. Berms are raised planting areas that sit just downhill from swales, where the captured water naturally moves. Mulch layers, whether organic material or living ground covers, shade the soil and reduce evaporation. Deep organic matter in the soil acts like a sponge, holding water and releasing it slowly to plant roots. When you design for water retention, instead of just irrigating harder, you can go days or even weeks between waterings. The system holds what it needs. You're not intervening, you're designing. Principle 7 is deep watering strategy, not frequent shallow watering. Here's the reality. When you water every day, plant roots stay shallow because they don't need to search for water. Shallow roots mean plants wilt fast when you miss a watering. They're dependent on you. Self-sufficient gardeners water less frequently, but deeply. Once or twice a week, soak the soil thoroughly. This forces roots to grow deep, chasing moisture downward. Deep roots access water you didn't put there. Deep roots tolerate heat and drought. Deep roots make plants independent. Principle 8 is microclimate creation. You're watering constantly because everything is exposed to full sun and wind. Self-sufficient gardeners use taller plants to create shade for heat-sensitive crops. They use dense plantings or hedgerows as windbreaks that reduce evaporation. They position water-loving plants in the lowest spots where water naturally accumulates. Every plant is placed based on its needs and the conditions the site naturally offers. You're working with the site, not against it. This is where it gets interesting. You're spending money on seeds every single season because you're treating plants as products instead of relationships. Principle 9 is seed saving. Self-sufficient gardeners let a few plants go to seed at the end of the season. They collect those seeds. They plant them next year. Those seeds are adapted to your soil, your climate, your microclimate. They perform better each generation because they're evolving in place. Tomatoes, peppers, beans, peas, lettuce, herbs. Most of what you grow can provide seeds for next year. One pack of seeds becomes a lifetime supply. You're not dependent on seed companies. You're not spending money every spring. You're building a seed bank that improves over time. Let me show you what this looks like in terms of money. Typical gardener buying seeds, starts, fertilizer, pest spray, mulch, amendments, new plants to replace failures. You're spending $200 to $500 per season, depending on garden size. Self-sufficient gardener using saved seeds, chop and drop fertility, living mulch, companion planting for pest control. After the initial setup, you're spending maybe $20 to $50 per season on new varieties you want to try or tools that wear out. That's not a small difference. Over 10 years, you're looking at $4,000 versus maybe $300. That's a vacation. That's a new roof. That's financial freedom bought back from a design that stopped needing constant inputs. And here's what might surprise you. This works in small spaces. You don't need acres. You don't need rural land. You don't need to be indigenous or have generations of knowledge. You need observation and willingness to design relationships instead of fighting problems. Principle 10 is start small and observe. Self-sufficient gardeners don't try to transform their entire yard in one season. They start with one guild, one polyculture, one Three Sisters planting. They watch how the plants interact. They notice which companions work in their specific microclimate. They learn which ground covers spread too aggressively and which ones stay polite. They observe before they expand. You can start with a 4x4 bed. Plant a tomato. Surround it with basil and marigolds. Add a ground cover of clover or thyme. Watch what happens. Next season, add another guild. Build your knowledge through observation, not through buying more products. Principle 11 is design for succession. Self-sufficient gardeners don't plant everything at once and then have a glut they can't process, followed by months of nothing. They plant early season crops, mid-season crops, and late season crops in the same space. Lettuce and peas in early spring, then tomatoes and peppers in summer, then kale and carrots in fall. The bed is always producing. You're always harvesting something. The soil is never naked. The system keeps working. You can layer this vertically too. Fast-growing radishes between slow-growing tomatoes. The radishes are harvested before the tomatoes need the space. Succession keeps the system productive and the soil covered. Principle 12, and this is the one that changes everything, is relationships over interventions. Self-sufficient gardeners don't feed plants directly. They feed soil biology. They don't kill pests. They create habitat for predators that eat pests. They don't water more. They design systems that hold water. Every problem gets solved by designing a relationship, not by adding an input. When you feed soil organisms with compost, mulch, and chop and drop plant material, those organisms break down organic matter and make nutrients available to plant roots. You're feeding the workforce that feeds your plants. When you plant flowers that attract ladybugs, lacewings, and parasitic wasps, those beneficial insects patrol your garden and eat the aphids, caterpillars, and beetle larvae before they become a problem. You're hiring security that works for free. This is the shift. Stop intervening. Start designing. Now let's talk about the objection I hear constantly. But I'm not indigenous. I don't have the knowledge. I don't have acres of land. I have a suburban yard with HOA rules, or a balcony with containers, or a small urban lot with shade and bad soil. Here's the reality. Indigenous growers spent generations observing relationships between plants, insects, soil, water, and climate. You're not appropriating their culture by learning from their observations. You're respecting the ecological principles they discovered through close attention to how nature actually works. Those principles apply anywhere, in any climate, in any space. You don't need acres. You need observation. A Three Sisters planting works in a container. Companion guilds work in raised beds. Chop and drop works in a 4x8 plot. Passive water retention works in a suburban yard with a slight slope. Living mulch works under fruit trees in HOA-approved landscapes. You can plant a food forest understory beneath existing ornamental trees. Shade-tolerant herbs, perennial vegetables, ground covers that produce food. Your neighbors see a nice landscape. You're harvesting from it weekly. You can plant polycultures that look ornamental, but function as food systems. Sunflowers with beans climbing them, and nasturtiums sprawling beneath. Beautiful, productive. No HOA violations. You don't need perfection. You need to start observing. Plant one guild this season. Watch how the plants interact in your specific conditions. Notice which companions thrive together. Notice where water naturally accumulates. Notice which areas stay moist and which ones dry out fast. Notice where pests show up and where they don't. Build your system based on what you observe, not on what a book says should work. Self-sufficient gardening isn't about following rigid rules. It's about designing relationships that regulate themselves. That's what indigenous growers did. They observed for generations, then designed systems that worked with the patterns they saw. You can start that observation in one season. You won't have generational knowledge, but you'll have enough to stop fighting and start designing. Think about your garden right now. Picture what changes when you stop planting rows of identical vulnerable plants and start planting teams where every member does multiple jobs. Picture what changes when you stop buying amendments and start building soil in place with chop and drop fertility. Picture what changes when you stop watering daily and start designing for passive water retention that gives you days or weeks between interventions. Picture what changes when you stop spraying pests and start planting flowers that attract predators who patrol for you. You get your weekends back. You stop spending hundreds of dollars per season on inputs. You stop feeling like gardening is a second job you're failing at. You start harvesting more food from less effort because the system regulates itself. That's what self-sufficient gardeners do differently. They design ecosystems, not battlefields. They observe relationships, not product labels. They build systems that give time back instead of stealing it. Stop fighting your garden. Start designing it. Give yourself your weekends back.